So there was me thinking that my Jordan Peterson arc had closed when I think someone linked me something on Twitter, which was a thread of Jordan Peterson talking about the Nazis and Hitler. And then I knew I had to make another video about, him and just this because it's absolutely bizarre. And I think the weirdest part of it all is he said these things in 2018 and there wasn't much of a notable pushback. But when we understand his entire worldview now and his rabid anti-leftism, anti-communism, pushing this cultural Marxism, fascist conspiracy theory, it makes a lot of sense that he would characterize the Nazis and would characterize Hitler in this way. Now, like many people who are experts in certain fields, Jordan Peterson thinks he basically knows everything, right? But it's very clear he actually has a very poor knowledge of history, specifically 1930s and 1940s Germany. And as we're going to get into conspiracy theory mode, is I believe Jordan Peterson purposefully downplays Nazism because he thinks communism is worse. Legit, I think he feels communism was a worse thing for the world than Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. And you will see the way he characterizes them, and there's actually a really good article written in Haaretz by someone who's an expert on the Nazis, a historian, who basically says this. And I feel like it's true because you could never imagine Jordan Peterson talking as positively about Joseph Stalin or even people like Khrushchev as positively as he talks about Adolf Hitler. And the most curious part of him talking about Nazism is that he completely omits the anti-communism, which is important not only because the Nazis were anti-communist, it's because they believed in Judeo-Bolshevism, in that communism was a Jewish ideology which was part of their plot to overthrow Western civilization and take it over for themselves. And if you were a communist, you were either a Jew or you were working for the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. From what I've seen in my research, Jordan Peterson does not actually acknowledge Judeo-Bolshevism, doesn't acknowledge the role anti-communism played or it being central to their whole ideology. He seems to believe that the Nazis and the Soviet Union were kindred spirits, and they essentially believed a similar version of the same thing. Not that to a lot of Nazis, when they were fighting the Soviets, they were fighting in their minds a race war against the Jews and against the Slavs. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to go through what Jordan Peterson has written and what he has exactly said in videos. And I'm going to respond to it personally. And then to back up my response, we're going to read some articles of people who are experts or read some direct sources of Hitler quotes which contradict basically Jordan Peterson's own characterization of Adolf Hitler. So all of that coming up for you in the video today. Please like the video. I guess in the comments, I would ask, what is one of the biggest red flag moments you have seen of any intellectual or public figure of someone discussing the Nazis? Admiration for Adolf Hitler and the economic miracle he worked in Germany is a big one, which we're going to discuss today. I've heard loads of people talk about that. Him being an amazing war leader, which is not true. There's so much weird Adolf Hitler simping from people who claim not like Nazism. Let me know in the comments what is the worst example, or even just in your personal life, what's the weirdest thing you've heard someone say about Hitler? Also, check out my social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and on Instagram. Check out the subreddit down in the description, and also check out my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra. Also consider becoming a patron. I'm trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and the benefits of that are getting access to the Discord server and also my Nintendo Switch friend code. And I'm probably going to post some Patreon exclusive content when I go to Vietnam in a couple weeks. Also, can I get a like on the video for it being insanely hot where I'm filming right now? I am absolutely boiling alive. It's another heat wave in the UK. I love capitalism for creating global warming. I've also been really busy this week, so I've actually come back from football training and it's 1 AM when I'm recording. And it's still not any cooler, but don't worry, we're gonna get through this. Got my Monster Energy again in a Starbucks cup. So let's get into Jordan Peterson's insane views on Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. So we're going to start with religion. According to Jordan Peterson, just like those dirty communists, the Nazis were all atheists, basically. And Nazism was an atheist ideology. And the reason that the Nazis and the Soviets, apparently, could commit just untold atrocities is because they forsaked the morality of Jesus Christ and God. Again, showing a very, very clear lack of knowledge on historic anti-Semitism and how Christianity obviously plays a massive role in this. Who have been the biggest tormentors of the Jews and biggest killers of the Jews throughout history, even before the Holocaust? It was European Christians. Doesn't take a genius to see how Nazism is compatible with Christianity. Jordan Peterson also let me know who Pope Pius sided with during the war. So you guys will know from that video I made of Jordan Peterson like 3 or 4 weeks ago that I've always hated him. Like, I've never fell for him, thankfully. And also I remember this, 4 years ago, he did a Reddit AMA and someone actually asked him, and they're like, you say the Nazis were atheists, they clearly weren't. Like, how do you respond to this? So let's get into this Reddit AMA. So 4 years ago, I am Jordan Peterson, U of T professor, clinical psychologist, and author of 12 Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning, and the creator of the self-authoring suite, Ask Me Anything. So a comment, 4 awards, 6.7k upvotes. Dr. Peterson, you've claimed that the atrocities of Nazi Germany came out of a loss of belief in God. However, only about 1.5% of Germans in 1939 claimed to lack a religious belief. And many of the anti-Semitic beliefs propagated by the Nazis were inspired of Christian figures like Martin Luther, who we're going to talk about. How can you explain the popular spread of Nazism in Germany as a result of atheism when the historical facts do not suggest such a conclusion? I like this comment. Jordan Peterson simply replies, Nazism was an atheist doctrine, so was Marxism. Minus 1.3 thousand downvotes. I'm so glad people did not fall for this. And then people just say in the comments, this is blatantly false. No tenet of Nazism denies God's existence. And he didn't even try to debate or answer the question. Just responded with this same nonsense rhetoric. What a clown. So again, extremely poor knowledge of just Christian history in general. For some reason, Jordan Peterson thinks Christians aren't capable of genocide. Christians aren't capable of reconciling Christianity with war. Has this guy ever heard of the First Crusade, where the Pope promised every person who died on it that they would actually get to go to purgatory because all of their sins would be forgiven, even murderers, even knights who had fought countless wars? And how many crusades were called? Not just against Muslims, against other Christian sects, against pagans. Again, Jordan Peterson's knowledge of history is extremely poor. But this comment also mentioned Martin Luther. Martin Luther is, of course, basically the founder of Protestantism, Lutheranism, which many people in Germany and places like America believed in. And Martin Luther was also an absolutely huge anti-Semite. And it's really not shocking that Christians who follow Luther's teaching can reconcile anti-Semitism with Christian views. Of course, going back thousands of years, Christians have always killed Jews because why? The Jews killed Jesus. That's the common thing they've always said. And even on the way to the First Crusade, the People's Crusade just killed a bunch of Jews in Hungary because they fought on this religious conquest and they should kill the people who killed Jesus. So I want to read a bit from an article which has some quotes from Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler about Christianity and about anti-Semitism. So look, I'm not a big fan of New Atheism, but this article was actually really good. So it's on the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, Michael Sherlock, refuting the atheist Hitler myth. So Hitler was a Christian. This undeniable fact couldn't be made any clearer than by his own confessions. Yet I will not merely present you with these testimonies, as damning as they happen to be on their own, but I also intend on furnishing you with a brief history of the inherent anti-Semitism of the Christian religion. I will do so to demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that Hitler and his Christian Nazi party were acting in complete concordance with the traditional Christian anti-Semitism. To begin with, here's a few of Hitler's Christian confessions. Besides that, I believe one thing, there is a Lord God, and this Lord God creates the peoples. We were convinced that the people need and require this faith. We have therefore undertaken the fight against the atheistic movement, and that not merely with a few theoretical declarations we have stamped it out, Adolf Hitler. My feelings as a Christian point me to my Lord and Saviour as a fighter. It points me to the man who once in loneliness, surrounded by a few followers, recognized these Jews for what they were and summoned men to fight against them, and who, God's truth, was greatest, not as a sufferer but as a fighter. In boundless love as a Christian and as a man, I read through the passage which tells us how the Lord at last rose in his might and seized the scourge to drive out the temple, the brood of vipers and adders, how terrific his fight for the world against the Jewish poison. Today, after 2,000 years, with deepest emotion, I recognize more profoundly than ever before the fact that it was for this that he had to shed his blood upon the cross. As a Christian, I have no duty to allow myself to be cheated but I had the duty to be a fighter for truth and justice. As a Christian, I also have a duty to my own people. So yeah, there is Hitler basically describing his Christian beliefs and how it informs his anti-Semitism. Doesn't seem like the leader of the Nazis was an atheist. So other equally strong pieces of evidence indicate that Hitler was a Christian, like the fact that his soldiers all wore the slogan, "God with us," on their belts, and that his birthday was celebrated from the pulpits until his death. So just moving on to Martin Luther to show how poorly Jordan Peterson understands, I guess, German Christianity and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitic rhetoric permeated the very fabric of Christian history and was eventually the inspiration for the founder of the Protestant Church, Martin Luther, who told Protestant Christians that they would be at fault if they didn't slaughter the Jews. Further still, citing Luther's own words from his polemic on the Jews and their lies, and the work of one of Luther's biographers, Robert Michael, who documented various speeches spewed into the ears of Luther's listeners, we suffer the following racist profanities. The Jews are a base, whoring people that is no people of God, and their boast of lineage and law must be accounted as filth. They are full of the devil's feces, which they wallow in like swine. The synagogue was a defiled bride, yes, an incorrigible whore and an evil slut. He argues that their synagogues and schools be set on fire, their prayer books destroyed, rabbis forbidden to preach, homes razed, and property and money confiscated. They should be shown no mercy or kindness, afford no legal protection, and these poisonous, envenomed worms should be drafted into forced labour or expelled for all time. So the Nazis were all atheists. Nazism was an atheist doctrine, despite Martin Luther very much sounding like Adolf Hitler himself in some of his quotes and beliefs about Jewish people. Again, it's very clear the Nazis were Christian. It's very clear their own views on the Jews were influenced and compatible with Martin Luther's own views on the Jews. And of course, he was the founder essentially of Protestantism and Lutheranism, which was very influential in Germany. How can you even read the evidence and decide that the Nazis were all atheists? But what is Jordan Peterson trying to do here? He's trying to equivocate, as he always does, the Soviet Union, Marxists, with Nazis. They are all evil, equally evil maybe, because they don't believe in God and they've forsaken Christian morality, because as we all know, Christians cannot do bad things, only atheists. So the one small caveat I want to talk about just quickly before we move on is that there were some Nazis who didn't like Christianity, right? They didn't like Christianity because they saw it as a Jewish religion. Heinrich Himmler was one of these people who basically believed in old pagan religion. And that's what members of the SS often believed in as well. They believed in old German pagan religions. They had pagan symbols and all that stuff. They were not atheists. Even if they weren't Christians and they thought Christianity was a Jewish religion, they were not atheists. They were pagans. So even if you're going to take the elements of the Nazis who did not like Christianity, there is no evidence to say these people did not believe in any higher power or any religion. For Jordan Peterson to say that, in light of the evidence from the comment, is just totally arrogant and shows you how full of shit he's always been, in that he will not back down when he's made something up. And as we're going to see later, in a little clip from the Hatefree podcast he did, he literally just makes everything up about Hitler to make him seem both more rational and downplay the Judeo-Bolshevism, to make it look like Hitler spontaneously started hating Jews. Not that it was outlined in Mein Kampf years before he got into power. So before we go on to the Hatefree podcast, there was another podcast with Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein. I can't believe anyone would ever want to watch this. It has, millions of views. And in it, they start talking about Nazi Germany. Now, I don't really want to discuss their argument, which was really weird. Brett Weinstein was talking about how Hitler was like a very rational person in that, killing all these other members of Germany to preserve like his vision of Germany was rational. It's a very bizarre conversation between them. And this is a very small part of it, but apparently Jordan Peterson has said this a lot. He talks about how Adolf Hitler and the Nazis worked wonders with the German economy. Like, got to hand it to that Hitler guy, despite all the awful things he did, worked wonders with the economy. And even if we're talking about like in the traditional capitalist way of the economy, it's really bizarre because, as most of you will know, what was the Nazi economy propped up on? Oh yeah, conquest, theft, expelling undesirables from society, shipping them off to camps, shipping them off to the gas chambers so they could steal their property. Yeah, Hitler rewarded a lot of the elites who ran capitalist corporations, and by conquering and stealing from German citizens and other European nations, he managed to prop up the Nazi war machine. Doesn't mean that he was some economic genius. So of course that's part of how the Nazis accumulated wealth, theft, and not just stealing your labor value, literally stealing from people. It plays into like a larger revisionist view that Hitler was an absolutely amazing leader, right? If he didn't do the bad things like the Holocaust and World War II, then he would have been an amazing leader. Apparently to people who are obsessed with not descending into fascism like Jordan Peterson. So let's have a look at the clip quick.
You're pointing out the danger of assuming that you can put Hitler in he was just a monster box and don't think about it anymore. And I would say I agree absolutely with that. I mean, I've studied Hitler a lot, and there's a bunch of things that you can't say about him. You can't say he was stupid.
Right.
You can't say he was without artistic talent. You can't say that he was a poor organizer. You can't say that he wasn't charismatic. You can't say that he did wonders for Germany's economy in the first part of his reign. It's very necessary if you're dealing intelligently with a true monster that you give the devil his due.
I mean, I know art is subjective. I wouldn't say Hitler was a very talented artist. I mean, yeah, he could draw stuff compared to like your average person, but compared to actual artists, he wasn't actually very good. But Jordan Peterson, you do not have to hand it to him. You do not have to hand it to Hitler, especially when you're just making shit up as well. I just find this praise for Hitler absolutely bizarre when it's well documented what an unstable person he was. Often unhinged, terrible war leader. So there's a really good article I was reading today which just goes into a bit more detail, apart from like the theft, obviously, of like Jewish businesses, Jewish properties, alleged Marxist properties and Marxist businesses. It just talks about how Germany's economy wasn't really that remarkable, even though it was built on like genocide and theft. So the not so good Hitler years. So the so-called good Hitler years in the mid-late 1930s still persist as a myth. You heard Jordan Peterson just say it. But at closer scrutiny, the myth falls apart. In extremely simplified terms, his economic policies were based on the idea of growth through conquest. To perform his conquest, he needed the growth of the economy and increased resources, which could only be won by conquest, and that's a circular self-referencing system that cannot work. German growth in the 1930s was not extraordinary compared to other Western countries. In fact, it was slightly below European averages. The only way you can see it as being great is if you compare it to the dismal years of hyperinflation in the 20s and the short-term dip of the German economy after the 1929 crash. The delta between the years before Hitler came to power to after might be huge, but compared to normalcy, it is not extraordinary. Moreover, as growth was starting from a heavily contracted economy after the crash, growth in real numbers was not as impressive as a percentile growth should indicate. As we shall see, this growth created artificially in preparation for conquest of resources and economic might. It is specifically here that the catch-22 of needing growth to conquer to create growth negates any possible effects. So here is just a graph of Germany's economy over the years. As you can see from the chart, Hitler didn't create growth in GDP that was any higher than the previous normal post-World War I years like 1927. Before 1927, reparations were still impacting the German economy, and as of 1929, the Depression pulled it down. As you can see, there's a big rally in 1933, the year Hitler seizes power, but that year the whole world economy was recovering, so this was pretty much average growth that cannot be attributable to any specific economic policy. More importantly, as economic policy takes time to have any measurable effects on economy, any growth in 1933 cannot be attributed to Hitler and the Nazis. At the end of the chart, you can also see how the need for large-scale conquest to grow is becoming apparent in 37 and 38. Technically, these years should automatically be higher growth years as the economy grows through the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Instead, we are seeing a slowing of GDP growth, which indicates that without annexation, the picture would be grimmer. The Nazis systematically plundered people they prosecuted and murdered. In Germany alone, they confiscated more than a year worth of GDP from German Jews, 120 billion Reichsmark. That is a redistribution of wealth in a very nasty way, and a redistribution doesn't create growth, it just moves money around. Moreover, incarcerating these people or murdering them took them out of the productive economy, so that any effect redistribution could have was nullified. As they started gobbling up nations, they did use slavery and forced labor to offset this effect, but this was too short-sighted and fairly uneconomic. In the end, we must not forget that the reason for prosecution and murder of undesirables was not financial, but ideological. So like that article was outlining with the help from the graph, there wasn't anything really remarkable about the Nazis and the economy. The main thing that distinguished them was that they would kill their own citizens and rob them and use that to fund their war effort, and their whole economy was designed for a war of conquest and plunder to prop it up. It was always a bubble that was going to burst. But yeah, there's a lot of myths about the Nazis going around, and as we've covered before in multiple videos, it's because the history of the war, especially against the Soviets, was written by former Nazi generals, lieutenants, and soldiers. And of course, I find this point quite bizarre anyway, but it's going to be talked about a bit more in the Hatred podcast he did, where he talks about basically Hitler kind of copying the masses' wishes, not that he had a very set ideology on what he wanted to do to Europe and Germany. And honestly, listening to the whole 6 minutes of this clip is really disgusting. And you wish he said this to someone who actually kind of knew this history. Like, I don't blame Ethan Klein for not being able to challenge Jordan Peterson on this stuff. I can't expect everyone to be an expert on historical revisionism or the actual history of the Nazis and the war with the Soviets and stuff like this. But I'm going to stop it at parts which I feel need comment and maybe read some quotes from Hitler. And then there's a little article which addressed this podcast on Haaretz, I was saying earlier, it's really good. And we're going to talk about how much Jordan Peterson lies. Because pretty much all the stories Jordan Peterson tells in this clip about Hitler are fabrication.
One of the things Hitler started, it's a very strange story in many ways, because Hitler was obsessed with order and cleanliness. He was a very orderly person. And he was very sensitive to disgust, because you think, well, the Nazis were afraid of the Jews, because they were other. And that's not right. What's more accurate is that especially Hitler, he was very sensitive to disgust. That's what it looks like. And if you're disgusted by something, then you want to eradicate it, right? If you're afraid of something, you want to run away from it. If you're disgusted by it, you want to burn it to the damn ground. You want to get rid of it. And his writings, like I read a book called Hitler's Table Talk, which was spontaneous discussions during dinner time from 1939 to 1942. It's really another amazing book. And we had been doing some work inspired a bit by Jonathan Haidt, who's done a lot of work on disgust and the relationship between trait personality. And I was reading this book at the same time, and it was just unbelievable how often Hitler referred to the people he was eradicating, the Slavs and the Gypsies and the Jews and all the people he went after, as parasites and as rats and as insects and all of that. So they were kind of put into that category. And here's a horrifying part of that story. Like when Hitler first came to power, he put in a lot of public health initiatives, including mass tuberculosis screening, which actually turned out to be a good thing. And at the same time, he went on a beautify the factories campaign. And so he convinced the German factory owners and so forth to increase the levels of hygiene in the factories, to get rid of the rats and the mice, to plant flowers out front, to make everything look neat and orderly. And the insecticide they used was Zyklon. Well, Zyklon, to eradicate the rats and the insects, Zyklon, a slightly different formulation, was the gas that was used in the concentration camps. And so Hitler went from cleaning up the rats and the mice in the factories and the insects, and then he went into the mental hospitals and started cleaning up in there. And then it just went broader and broader, again, sort of one step at a time.
So I think that little clip there has to have been some of the most disgusting revisionism I've ever heard about the Holocaust, in that Hitler probably did the Holocaust because he was like a clean freak, essentially. So he pursued these public health campaigns in Germany, TB screenings and stuff, although that didn't actually happen, so that's a total lie to start with. And he was so disgusted by the Jews, he kind of viewed them as rats, basically. All people he didn't like in Germany, he viewed them as rats. And because he was such a disgusted clean freak, he started just killing them all, right? This is why so many red flags go off. And why does he not talk about why Hitler actually hated the Jews? Why is he saying that Hitler was disgusted by the Jews? He saw them as vermin, right? And that's why he hated them. Not that he described them as vermin because he hated them for other reasons. It's totally bizarre. I cannot understand how anyone who isn't sympathetic to fascism describes Hitler's Holocaust like this. It is the most insane stuff ever. And I'm going to read some quotes from Mein Kampf now to make it very clear that Hitler did not kill the Jews and other people he saw as undesirables because he was a clean freak. And he didn't pursue public health campaigns because he was just obsessed with cleanliness. And I just find it bizarre Jordan Peterson would even make this up. He's clearly been reading fabrications, and that Conversations book he brings up, we're going to talk about that a bit later, that is also made up. So like I said, let's read some Mein Kampf, and this is why I have so many red flags about Jordan Peterson's views of the Nazis. Of course, Hitler hated the Jews for many reasons, One of them that was pretty central was Judeo-Bolshevism, right? He believed the protocols of the Elders of Zion. He'd believed the elite who migrated from Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, that the Jews had overthrown them. And Jordan Peterson acts like Hitler didn't have an ideology behind this. He was just disgusted by the Jews. So let's read a couple quotes of Mein Kampf to prove my point, and to prove my point that if you really care about being anti-Nazi and against fascism, then you would never characterize Hitler like this, in the way that Jordan Peterson continually praises Hitler for certain things. So, extracts from Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. So, the Jewish doctrine of Marxism rejects the aristocratic principle of nature and replaces the eternal privilege of power and strength by the mass of numbers and their dead weight. Thus, it denies the value of personality in man, contests the significance of nationality and race, and thereby withdraws from humanity the premise of its existence and culture. If, with the help of its Marxist creed, the Jew is victorious over the other peoples of the world, his crown will be the funeral wreath of humanity, and this planet will, as it did thousands of years ago, move through the ether devoid of men. Hence today I believe I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator by defending myself against the Jew. I am fighting for the work of the Lord. To what an extent the whole existence of his people is based on a continuous lie is shown incomparably by the protocols of the Elders of Zion, so infinitely hated by the Jews. They are based on a forgery. The Frankfurter Zeitung moans and screams once every week, the best proof that they are authentic. For once this book has become the common property of the people, the Jewish menace may be considered as broken. The ignorance of the brood masses about the inner nature of the Jew, the lack of instinct and narrow-mindedness of our upper classes, make the people an easy victim for this Jewish campaign of lies. Slowly, fear and the Marxist weapon of Jewry descend like a nightmare on the mind and soul of decent people. They begin to tremble before this terrible enemy and thus have become his final victim. So he tries to systemically to lower the racial level by a continuous poisoning of individuals, and in politics he begins to replace the idea of democracy by the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the organised mass of Marxism, he has found the weapon which lets him dispense with democracy, in its stead allows him to subjugate and govern the people with a dictatorial and brutal fist. The most frightful example of this kind is offered by Russia, where he killed or starved about 30 million people with positively fanatical savagery, in part amid inhuman tortures, in order to give a gang of Jewish journalists and stock exchange bandits domination over a great people. So that's just some extracts of Mein Kampf, where Hitler talks about the Jews using Marxism to take over the world, right? And why I think Jordan Peterson either willingly never talks about this or doesn't care for it is because he himself is a massive anti-communist. And in my opinion, he literally believes communism is the most evil ideology to ever existed, and he generally believes communism is worse than Nazism. So if you start talking about how the Holocaust came about, maybe it's more fitting to talk about Hitler's disgust at the Jews just generally because he was a clean freak and then he saw them as like vermin against his race, while not acknowledging the elders of the Protocol of Zion, the Bolshevik Revolution and its influence on Germany itself, or Hitler's belief that the Jews were using the weapon of Marxism to take over Germany. Why does Jordan Peterson not talk about these things? Because it's a massive motivator for Hitler, and Mein Kampf was written well before he was the leader of Germany. So why does Jordan Peterson act like it started off with public health campaigns and slowly built into eradicating people as some sort of like logical step in Hitler's mind, rather than he has clearly said in Mein Kampf he wants to kill the Jews because he thinks they're the enemy of Western civilization and Germany, and they're using Marxism to take over the world and bring the world back to the Dark Ages. Why does Jordan Peterson not frame Hitler's ideology like this? It's absolutely bizarre, and the way he describes all of this is just insane to me. And as I've said a lot in the past, which in my opinion is true, anti-communism as a political ideology, not as just like a belief, like you don't want to be a communist, you don't think communism is the best thing for society, being like an anti-communist, you have to buy into either conspiracy theories that are anti-Semitic and racist, or you have to believe literature written by actual Nazis about the Soviet Union or about Nazi Germany's role in the war. And it seems Jordan Peterson does just this because he references so many things that are total bullshit. So there's a couple more points he talks about in the video, so I want to get into them. So here is like the rest of the video.
You know, and the Germans had plenty of reason to be resentful and hateful because, I mean, think about what they went through. We can't even imagine it. First of all, there was World War I, and so there was many men, like Hitler himself, who served in the trenches. And there's one story about Hitler. He won a medal for heroism in World War I, and he was sitting around with a group of his buddies and went off to do something, God only knows what. And when he came back, they were all dead because a mine had, not a mine, I don't remember, some kind of shell had landed in the middle of them and killed them all. It's like, that changes you.
Yeah.
You know, and then afterwards there was all these brutalized men who'd come out of the trenches. I mean, you just can't imagine what it must have been like in the trenches, you know, especially if you were there for like a couple of years. You weren't the same person. Get out of there, you're unemployed, your country's in ruins. Then the hyperinflation hits, and every single person in Germany who ever saved any money at all is flat, bloody broke. And then there's a communist revolution brewing in Russia, and it's like, it's hell. And the Nazis came along and said, well, not only are we going to restore order and greatness, but we're going to bloody well tell you whose fault this is. It's like, and Hitler, I've studied him a lot trying to understand what happened, and Hitler was, Carl Jung called him the mouthpiece of the collective unconscious of the German people. So you imagine there's all this resentment and hatred brewing underneath the surface, and all this chaos is there, and the desire for order is like clamoring in everyone's minds. And Hitler comes along, and he's a very powerful emotional orator, and he's watching the crowd, and he listens. And when he says thing A, nothing happens. And when he says thing B, everybody roars. And so he takes note of that. And it's not even conscious exactly, right? Because he's being molded by the crowd. And so they roar. And so so that's a reinforcement. That's a reward. And so then he goes down that line a little bit farther, and they roar some more, and then he tries something else, and it's silent.
It becomes like, what they want.
You bet. Exactly that, man. He acts out the dark desire of the mob. So he becomes the embodiment of the dark desire of the mob. And that's partly why he had the charisma. It's right, because there's this unconscious fantasy brewing in the back of everyone's minds. You see that to some degree now with Antifa, for example, and their proclivity towards violence. You know, and you ask, just exactly what's going on there? Well, Hitler came to embody the desire of the German people for order and revenge.
Did he seriously just compare Antifa to Hitler? But again, more disgusting revisionism. He's acting like Hitler went around Germany, said anything that came to mind, and when the crowd gave him a positive reaction, he then decided, well, yeah, that's my ideology now. Again, this guy literally knows nothing about Hitler. Hitler had a concrete ideology, which he wrote basically when he was in prison, and you can go and read it, and you can see how that ideology actually physically translated to the Nazi German rule. And he's acting like Hitler was the embodiment of every single German, and he just went around throwing like spaghetti at the wall and seeing what stuck. And one day he probably said that he didn't like the Jews, and the crowd roared, so he decided, I don't like the Jews. Again, you can read his book, you can read his ideology, you can see the Judeo-Bolshevism stuff. This was long before he came to power. He always believed in this stuff. So how is Jordan Peterson telling people Hitler was basically the mouthpiece of the mob? If you're trying to say to me that Hitler rose to power because so many Germans were devastated by World War I and the economy and stuff like that, that's a different argument. And of course, the historical context of how Hitler was actually even able to get into power is important. But that's not what Jordan Peterson is saying here. He's not saying that Hitler preyed on people's like most base instincts to like anti-Semitism and racism and stuff like that. He's literally characterizing Hitler like some sort of ideological opportunist, which again, you can read Mein Kampf. I read you some of it. Does anything that I read you seem like something that is contradictory to what he actually did when he was in power? Again, totally insane historical revisionism. And also that story about World War I with Hitler coming back and finding all his men dead, again, bullshit. And then he's talking about Hitler being like a World War I hero. Why are you saying this stuff? And of course, World War I changed people. Do you know who else fought in World War I? Tito fought for Austria-Hungary. You know, another empire that lost World War I. He then became a massive resistance fighter against the Nazis and their collaborators. It seemed like, in my opinion, while trying to get into the psychology of Hitler, he comes out of it making Hitler look far better than he has any right to look. So this was all like in 2018, and there were a couple articles about it at the time. I'm going to read one of them for you. But honestly, the lack of coverage this issue has got, despite the fact that he's given like so many lectures on this and talked about it so much on podcasts, is really bizarre to me, especially because it's a guy who staked his claim to fame by pushing an actual fascist conspiracy theory, just readjusting some parts of it to put in some, I don't know, 1960s postmodernist stuff in cultural Marxism. So Haaretz is an Israeli outlet, and although I find it to be like more like liberal Zionist, I do think they do good coverage of certain things. And this is a good article itself. So Mikael Nilsson is a Swedish historian based in Stockholm, Sweden, specializing in Hitler and National Socialism. His latest book, Hitler Redux, The Incredible History of Hitler's So-Called Table Talks, which is what Jordan Peterson was talking about, will be out in fall 2020. So I love the way he starts his article. We're not going to go through all of it, but quote, "You have to admire Hitler because he was an organizational genius. These are not the words of a neo-Nazi, they are the words stated with the utmost conviction by Jordan Peterson, the psychologist and anti-political correctness guru, whose YouTube channel boasts more than 2.8 million subscribers. Peterson has repeatedly said that he has studied Hitler a lot, but every statement he utters about Hitler makes this very hard to believe. It's worth diving into Peterson's unsettling understanding of Hitler, from his strangely generous framing of the Nazi leader, through his misrepresentation of chronology, his misuse of historical sources, to his odd rewriting of Holocaust history." So, in referencing the story that Jordan Peterson talked about how Hitler was changed by World War I, the author goes on to say, "There is only one problem, this story never happened. It is an open question why Peterson would seek to offer an anecdote that presents Hitler as a victim of psychological trauma, even valorizing him. But that is only the beginning of Peterson's serial problems of historical sources. Peterson has on several occasions talked about how he has read Hitler's Table Talk, a compilation which Peterson says records Hitler's spontaneous dinner time comments from 1939 to 42, in reality 41 to 44. He notes how it struck him how many times Hitler referred to the Jews as parasites, rats, and insects, but the book only mentioned the word parasite 3 times, and only once in reference to the Jews, insects only mentioned twice, once in relation to the Russian people, and once about actual insects, and the word rats is mentioned 7 times, is only used about actual rats. Furthermore, Hitler's Table Talk does not contain Hitler's words verbatim. It is a collection of edited notes made largely from memory, and it has to be treated with the critical skepticism that such a source demands. The English translation from 1953 is horribly flawed. It is freely translated from a previous French translation in which the text had been seriously tampered with. Peterson uses this false narrative of concern with health and cleanliness to argue that Hitler in 1933 initiated mass TB screenings, which actually turned out to be a good thing, but no such massive screenings for the benefit of public health occurred. The Nazis considered TB a sign of racial inferiority and often referred to Jews as the racial TB, infecting the Volk body politic. Screenings were not a good thing, but were used to identify people deemed unworthy of life. TB was effectively used as a biological weapon in the ghettos and concentration camps during the war. Peterson is conflating the symptom with the disease. Nazi propaganda indeed often used tropes and images expressing disgust for the Jews, but this was a consequence of their anti-Semitism, not a cause for it. Thank you, that is exactly what I was saying. Peterson's reframing of the genocidal Nazi hostility to the Jews as a natural or instinctive response to disgust minimizes and effectively denies the role of rabid anti-Semitism in explaining the Holocaust. Hitler did not orchestrate the Holocaust because he had OCD. He and his Nazi henchmen did it because they were anti-Semites. Again, thank you, someone else agreeing with me that his downplaying of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism is insane. I don't know the politics of the author, but I find this really interesting. So, why does Peterson's misinformation matter? There is perhaps an ideological answer to this conundrum. Peterson has a long history of equivocating between Nazism and communism and suggesting an absolute equivalence between Nazi death camps and, for instance, the Soviet Gulag camps. He seems unable to really see the very crucial differences, perhaps blinded by his equally manifest hostile obsession with what he calls cultural Marxism. The railing against cultural Marxism, a phrase of a long anti-Semitic history, is of course something that Peterson has in common with Hitler and the Nazis. It is his blind spot, and to what degree his hatred of Marxism has influenced his analysis and understanding of Hitler and National Socialism is unknown. I think it's pretty evident here. It is not unreasonable to assume that this monomania has affected not only his framing of Nazism, but goes to the heart of his discomforting take on the Holocaust and its perpetrators. Peterson has certainly never suggested in a lecture that we should admire Stalin's organizational genius, even though he far outshined Hitler in that particular department. While it's acceptable to Peterson to praise Hitler for what good he did for the economy or for improving public health in Germany, he would never ever dream of praising Stalin for the same achievements of the Soviet Union. Peterson insists that the crimes of communism were a matter of Marxist ideology running its course, but when he analyses Nazi crimes, the diagnosis is quite different. He ignores the actual causation of the Holocaust, racist anti-Semitic hatred, and reduces it to a universal human instinct, disgust. This is why Peterson's statements about Hitler are not only ignorant but also dangerous. They feed into the victimhood narrative so central to the alt-right's identity politics. If there is a way to justify even Hitler's hatred and resentfulness, then surely there's a way to legitimise anyone else's. It's a short step to explaining today's radical right as a group of confused incels acting out of their universal and reasonable resentfulness and hatred. They become rather harmless. But Peterson offers no such discounts to the radical left. For him, they are the real threat today because of their ideological motivation. Peterson has indeed suggested that Antifa is similar to the Nazis because of their proclivity to violence. I absolutely love that article from someone who obviously knows what they're talking about in response to Jordan Peterson's insane view on the Nazis. And again, I don't know how this has gone so under the radar of so many people that he clearly does not understand the ideological justification the Nazis had for carrying out the Holocaust. Like this article said, and like I was saying, he literally acts like Hitler did it because he has OCD about cleanliness, not that he has a very deliberate ideology which he outlined in a massive book that you can go read if you're so obsessed with Hitler. And there's only two possibilities here, right? Jordan Peterson is extremely ignorant of history, right? Because if he read Mein Kampf, do you think he'd be saying these things about Hitler? I mean, he could be saying these things about Hitler, but then the only other alternative is he is sympathetic in some way to Hitler, or he admires Hitler, so much so he downplays the very evident anti-Semitism, racism, anti-communism, which merge with anti-Semitism of Hitler and the Nazis, instead favouring to frame it as a guy who carried out some of the worst atrocities in modern human history on, his obsession with cleanliness. With everything we spoke about, combined with him pushing this cultural Marxism, fascist conspiracy theory, again, this is why people hate Jordan Peterson. This is why Nazis love Jordan Peterson, because he's framing Hitler in a positive light while always believing fascist sources about communist regimes. And like this article made the great point, he would never say any of this stuff about any leader of the Soviet Union. He would never say this about Xi Jinping. He would never say this about Fidel Castro. He would never say this about Ho Chi Minh and the leaders of communist Vietnam. But he's happy to praise Hitler and praise the good he did, the economic genius of Hitler in rebuilding the German economy, the good public health programs he did, which never existed. I will leave people with this question, and you can answer in the comments if you want. Do you believe Peterson's anti-communism makes him susceptible to more like fascist-adjacent arguments about Nazi Germany, or do you believe Jordan Peterson is some sort of closet Nazi? Let me know down in the comments, and that is it for the video. And I hope what I've done in this video, although I'm talking about Jordan Peterson, is responded to some very popular verboom myths about Nazi Germany generally and about Hitler, and hopefully debunked widely held myths about, I guess, the positive aspects of Hitler, how he was a great leader, charismatic, a genius with the German economy, and an OCD freak who only did the Holocaust because he was obsessed with cleanliness or some shit. That is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.